The group of 7 countries, along with Australia and the European Union, have now agreed on a $60 per barrel price cap on the Russian crude oil. With this, what the G7 and the EU nations intend to do is to reduce the war chest, the resources that Russia has at its disposal to carry on with its war in Ukraine. And this now raises a whole host of different questions, and we intend to explore that. Firstly, what is this price cap about? How does it work? And will Moscow accept this price cap by the G7 and the EU? And what if Russia decides to take off its crude oil altogether from the market? And can the oil price cap actually cut Vladimir Putin's income? If yes, by how much? Thirdly, what happens to the global oil market stuff? And how will the price cap affect other countries of the world? And what will the price cap do to markets like India and China? So let's explore some of these answers. Firstly, about the oil price cap. The cap prevents firms in participating countries from providing shipping insurance and other services to shipments of Russian crude oil that are sold above the set price. In practice, this means that the onus will of course be on these providers to ask their clients for proof that they have purchased crude at a cap-compliant price. But in practice, it is perfectly possible for the shipping industry to misrepresent or obscure the origin of its cargo. Now, the cap doesn't fully address blends that include Russian crudes, and this, of course, leaves opportunity to maneuver Russian barrels through refined or partially refined products. And finally, it will be pretty difficult for countries enforcing the cap to truly track the paid price, given the market's opacity. And finally, the crucial test of the policy's viability will of course lie in the enforcement of the cap when breaches inevitably happen. The Kremlin hasn't reacted yet on this decision, although the Russian embassy in the United States has said that the price cap for the Russian oil means in practice that the basic principle of free market has been reshaped. It also has shown confidence in the demand for the Russian crude oil. Earlier, Russia had opposed the measure and had even threatened to stop production in response. But on Thursday, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov hinted with a softened stance. He said that any cap would be irrelevant, adding that Russia will negotiate with its partners directly. But the outlook is nonetheless pretty bleak for the Russian economy, because this is a measure that, remember, has been brought in picture to try and reduce the resources that Russia, of course, has. It's also interesting to note at this point of time that the price cap is at $60 per barrel. Reports say that it is still about the $50 per barrel rate at which Russia's flagship Urals grade trades it. But at this point of time in the international market, the Russian Urals is trading at about $64. So the question, of course, is how much of an income of the Russian economy would be drained because of this price cap that's been put in place, which will be imposed very shortly by the G7, the EU and Australia. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what this price cap actually means and how will it affect the war in Ukraine and also the international oil markets, we're being joined by Andrew Korybko, who's joining us live from Moscow, and he's, of course, a policy expert. Now, Mr. Korybko, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. The question that I want to ask you is, firstly, how much and to what extent do you think this price cap that's been proposed by the G7 and the EU will impact the export of Russian crude to the rest of the world?
Okay, well, first off, thank you for having me on your program. I sincerely appreciate it. Now, to answer your question, we should begin by laying the backdrop here. The top purchasers of Russian crude right now are China and India, and this price cap does not seem to affect Russia's exports to those two countries. Now, according to reports, we don't know the exact price, but it's widely speculated that those two countries are importing Russian crude at a below-market rate with heavy discounts. That being the case, they had not been complying with any so-called ceiling because no such ceiling had previously been in place. I therefore am confident that the existing rates at which Russia is exporting its crude to China and India will remain consistent. So that being the case, I don't expect any disruption of existing Russian exports. However, precisely because the Kremlin has been very insistent on not complying with this so-called price cap, what that means in practice is that any future Russian oil partners or any existing ones other than China and India that would want to maybe purchase some Russian oil at or below that cap, Russia is more than likely not going to sell to them. So pretty much, in short, those countries that it's already selling to will more than likely be grandfathered in, specifically China and, of course, India. But I don't expect Russia to expand as partners. Therefore, the existing partners will probably be able to purchase a lot more.
You know, Mr. Korupko, the question that I want you to, in fact, touch upon is, you know, the fact is the G7 and the EU have said that they want to impose a price cap of $60 per barrel. At this point of time, last Friday, when the trading closed, the Russian Urals crude was trading at about $64 per barrel. So there's a difference of about $4. Do you think that's substantial enough for it to impact Russia's revenues that it generates by exporting oil?
Well, what we have to remember is that Russia has received record revenues over the past year, ironically enough, precisely because the sanctions had previously spiked the oil price. So Russia has actually already made more money this year than it previously has. That being the case, there's enough of a cushion to be able to compensate for any potential decline in exports in the case that any existing partners, again, not counting China and India, would decide to comply with the price cap. So I do not expect this to significantly affect any of Russia's budgetary revenue. And even if there were to be any effect, let's say across the next couple months, because everything is still more or less pretty uncertain. We're in uncharted territory here. I mean, countries had not previously imposed such a cap. I don't think that's going to achieve the goal of influencing the course of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, because we need to remember that Russia understands its military activity there as being in defense of its national security red lines in Ukraine that it accuses NATO of crossing. So with NATO crossing those red lines in Ukraine and now trying to deprive Russia of revenue, it would be a series of unilateral concessions on issues that Russia regards as being of premier national security significance to allow any potentially depleted revenue to affect the course of the campaign.
All right. Now, very interesting. Now, Russia has in the past threatened that a price cap that would seek to seriously deplete its resources would mean that Russia too may have to take some pretty drastic steps. But it had said that it may want to stop selling oil to those nations that adhere to the price cap. Do you think, with what has now happened, Russia may consider that?
I do believe that we should keep that in mind. However, it's important to also keep in mind that there was a report from last month. I forget from which think tank. It was a think tank from Finland, but the name eludes me at the moment. And they had compellingly argued that actually Russia has been selling oil to Turkey, formerly known as Turkey, and this oil had been processed and re-exported to the EU. Now, if this report was credible, this suggests that there is a workaround to the price cap itself. And therefore, this would raise suspicions that the price cap is more or less a political move designed to try to signal this pretense of Western solidarity in the face of the Ukrainian conflict, exhibiting enormous cost on the European economies that capitulated to American pressure to sanction Russia. I personally suspect that that is the case, that this is mostly a political gesture that is not going to have much of a significance in terms of what it's aiming to achieve, depriving the Kremlin of budgetary revenue with the long-term intent of influencing the course of a special operation. Therefore, I do believe that while Russia will directly stop exporting to countries that comply with this price cap, I nevertheless suspect that those same countries will find alternative means to compensate for the decrease of Russian imports, whether directly through the United States by importing more expensive oil from the United States or other partners, or perhaps indirectly via Turkey, according to this prior report that I was citing from late last month.
Absolutely indeed, Mr. Korupko. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Moscow and getting us all those insights. Many people would be looking at this price cap that's been announced by the G7 and EU as a very cosmetic measure, because when the international market rate for the Russian Urals grade crude oil is $64, a price cap of about $60 does not make that much of a difference, is what some people would, of course, say. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Moscow there.
Thank you.
And we also earlier spoke with Mr. Peter Klepp, who is the editor-in-chief of the Brussels report, and this is what he had to say about this proposed price cap by the EU and the G7.
I think there's a lot of uncertainty on what the practical consequences will be. So let's not forget that there were already sanctions in place on Russian oil exports, but Moscow has managed to cope with that by basically increasing the supply of oil. At the moment, the big bottleneck for Russia that people predict seems to be the number of tankers to transport the oil. So again, there are reports that Russian entities would have purchased a lot of oiled tankers in order to then, transport all the crude and refined oil from February. That would no longer be permitted in theory, but they would try to circumvent the new sanctions in this way. I think that's sort of where the real questions are. To what extent will this Russian strategy work? Of course, also oil demand will play a big role, and then we have to look at China and the zero COVID policies. Will China continue with its extreme zero COVID policies or not? And there are reports that China is finally ending this this problematic policy. So I think, yeah, a lot of it depends on all of that.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.